Hello, this is Gabe Larson. Welcome to today's webinar. We're excited to have you. Great topic today. We're going to be speaking about how Arctic Wolf increased revenue with sales acceleration technology and a proactive approach to more conversations. Now, we've got people trickling in, so before we jump right in, we're going to play a 30-second video just to introduce InsideSales.com and what we do here.
Henry decided that he wanted to win Le Mans. He set his sights on the most prestigious race, certainly in Europe at that particular time.
Well, in '65, we struck out again, you know. The little Ferrari taxi cabs were there after midnight and all day long. The next day we were sitting on the sideline, so we had to eat crow again.
Alrighty. I think I maybe said 30 seconds, but it was more like 2 minutes. Apologize for that. But we're ready to get going here. Gonna jump into the agenda, but just to make sure everyone's aware, we want this to be as interactive as possible. There's a little box in the bottom of your screen. It says Q&A. I want you to pop that open, type your name and where you're from, just so you get familiar with it, and we can start kind of seeing who's joining us here today. Okay, looks like we got, we got Steve from Market Source. Steve, glad you're on. Looks like we got Jeanette from Hitachi, John, Lars, fantastic. So go ahead and keep popping that in there. And then if you do have any questions throughout the session, feel free to use that Q&A box and we'll try to answer those as they come up. Now, to the actual agenda, we got a great outline for you, and we got two speakers I'm going to introduce in just a minute here. We're going to talk a little bit about what we want to do today, who Arctic Wolf is. Then we're going to talk about where they began their sales transformation journey, where they've ended up, and my goodness, some of the amazing results that I think they've been able to accomplish as they've looked at this holistically. Now, let's talk about our speakers. I'm going to do a brief introduction, and then as they go through, they'll have the opportunity maybe to add a little bit more about their experience and what they've brought. So first and foremost, we've got Brian Naismith, President and CEO of Arctic Wolf Networks. Brian's got a fantastic resume, has been able to do a lot at Arctic Wolf, as well as a couple other places. We've got Tibor Shanto. Now, Tibor has been a great help in helping Arctic Wolf achieve some of their results. He's a principal at Rebor Sales Solutions, and you'll hear more a little bit about that as we go through the presentation. And then myself, Gabe Larson, I run our services group here at InsideSales.com. You see our information on LinkedIn and Twitter. I'd be angry if you don't connect with all of us because we'd love to continue the dialogue as we go forward. Now, let's go ahead and get into the meat of the presentation. So before we get into the actual where we are and where we've been, Brian, maybe you could just give a quick overview for everyone as to who Arctic Wolf Networks is and some of the things you've been able to accomplish over there in the last few years.
Sure, Gabe, thanks. Very quick, it's not so much that the specific business that we're in is particularly relevant to this conversation, but it's good to have the context. We sell a service solution that's targeted for how companies might improve security, specifically what we call Security Operations Center as a service. And we just basically collect data from the organization and help them identify whether they've been breached or compromised, whether they have malware. It's a continuous service that we deliver for those customers and help them really improve the robustness of their security. We started about 4 years ago, been through a couple of fundraising rounds. We're actually located in both Canada and the United States. We have an office in Waterloo, Ontario, and here in Sunnyvale, California. We actually do the function that we're talking about here in both locations. So we've got diversity of both geographically by time zone as well as diversity in country, even though it's just Canada and the U.S. They still are different countries. But no, great and looking forward to talking about what we're doing here.
No, appreciate the overview. I think there some of the growth you guys have experienced, the funding, certainly some great things going on over there at Arctic Wolf. So interested to hear a little bit about your story. So I want to dive into the audience. You will see throughout a couple poll questions that'll pop up on your screen. Would love for you to answer those. As I said, we want to make this as interactive as possible. So to begin, when Brian and I were kind of going over this with Tibor, we thought it's probably best just to kind of set the foundation of, okay, let's go back a couple months and see where we were originally. What was the organization look like? What were maybe some of the challenge that Arctic Wolf was experiencing? Maybe you can talk a little bit about where the journey began, Brian.
Sure. So I think like many companies, when you jump into the industry, we obviously wanted to try to sell this wonderful solution that we built for customers. And as many people realize, they don't obviously just immediately flock to that solution. So we put in some people that let's reach out to some target companies that we think might be interested in that solution. And we started putting together a set of calling activities. I would say we were a bit chaotic. We didn't have any automation in place. It was literally pull down the phone book, dial the next one, write down some notes by hand, and trying to reach people. Now, we did get some success. It's like a lot of things in sales. I think that it just wasn't at the productivity levels that we would have liked. Even when we did get those conversations, we realized that very often we'd start talking to a prospect and they'd say, yeah, not interested. We all live getting cold calls from people, even for home products. And so getting through that noise and the challenges around those people being buried by lots of people trying to call them, how do you get over some of those objections was a real challenge for us. So we did get some success, and we realized that, cold calling does work, especially if you can put some emphasis in some certain areas, but we had a lot of challenges, and as a result, we grew fairly frustrated at the performance that we're seeing, and started to wonder whether this is worth doing, and so that's where we started out.
Yeah, I love it, because I think some people on the line are probably thinking, God, did he actually really pull down the yellow pages or the phone book? But I mean, many of us, I think, Brian, do that, whether it's the phone book itself or we just randomly start hunting and pecking of random people we find online. There isn't often a large strategy, and then we just kind of spend all the time building the product and didn't think about the sales strategy coming after. So I know you've highlighted a handful of potential areas of opportunity that as you began the journey, you kind of took a step back and said, okay, got a good product, we know that. It's probably time to kind of double down on our sales org and marketing org and it sounded like you listed a handful of priorities and said, these are the things we need to see if we can't slowly check off in order to get us from kind of second base to third base.
Yeah, a couple of things really stood out for me as I started this experience. And just so the audience was aware, I was actually one of the salespeople doing some of this cold calling. So I actually managed and lived this experience with some folks as well. And one of the things that really hit me home is you have several different activities that, in many cases, you need to think of them very differently. One is, who does qualifies and creates a list of contacts for you to try to reach out and call, and that research, whether it's going to LinkedIn or whether it's subscribing to a database, or the worst case going to Yellow Pages. How do you do that, and what do you do? And very often the people that make the calling aren't necessarily the best people for managing that list of contacts. And we also saw that even getting to the right title and what we're going to do, and then when you do get somebody on the phone or you do leave a voicemail, how do you manage how you're going to get to that? And so in many cases, we might get somebody on the phone and they'd say, yeah, send me some literature. I think I might be interested. We weren't too clear in many cases about the right kind of follow-up and what's the right way to do with it. And in the end, it's just we found we were talking to a lot of people, but in many cases not the right people. And even when we did sometimes get to those right people, just the conversations weren't on target, and so we would meander a bit in what we were doing. And so we broke it down as we saw really possibilities for improvement, obviously huge rooms for improvement just from the list that's shown on the slide that we're presenting, and started to put together a plan, for what we wanted to do.
Yeah, I didn't actually realize, Brian, that you were just part of the sales org, so you actually breathed this, lived it, and kind of felt the pains along with a couple of the other salespeople who were joining you in those early days. Is that right?
Yeah, I was for about the first 4 months, I was averaging probably between 40 and 50 dials a day, and all manual, goodness. All done by myself. And after a while, I started to get fairly frustrated that there's got to be a better way for doing this, and then that started to trigger the thought all over, overall.
I love it.
Not just doing the cold calling, but also doing the account management aspect, so the account executive side of it. So doing some of those early meetings and, the result of what we wanted to get to. But yeah, it was an interesting experience.
I may have to use it. Right, Timur. I may have to use you, Brian, because oftentimes we'll hear sales reps say, hey, I can't do, more than 10 or 15 activities a day. And Brian just disproved that. Being CEO, account manager, and sales rep and still doing 40 plus dials, there's just no excuses. I may have to pull that one out sometime. So I want to ask the group real quick. I mean, Brian's listed a handful of kind of areas of opportunity. I've thrown out a poll question here. Which of these currently creates the biggest bottleneck in your lead conversion process? Do you resonate with some of the things that Brian just mentioned? So loss of productivity or misdirected effort, unstructured follow-up, your cadence isn't there, not enough conversations, poor conversations, or is it something else? I'm going to give you just 30 seconds. See if you can fill that out, and then we'll go ahead and show the result. I'll just go. All right, let's go ahead and see the results here. We got a couple hundred people. Looks like 20. Whoa, not enough conversations with targeted prospects. I was thinking it was going to be mostly loss of productivity. Tibor, I'd love to hear your opinion. You're in this world a lot. Surprised at some of the results, that it's mostly kind of 1 in 4 there?
Yeah, I'm surprised that the not enough is as high as it is, because most organizations I speak to tend to talk more about the productivity, the quality of the conversations, but most of them seem to feel that they are contacting the right amount of people. So I'm surprised that took such a high flow. I'm also surprised that the process didn't rank a little bit higher, because again, a lot of the organizations, and something that Brian spoke to, is that they did put together quite a specific process for who qualifies the lead, who then contacts it, what happens to once the account development rep has qualified an opportunity, how he hands it off to the account manager, and so on. So I would have thought that the lack of process would have scored higher. But maybe we have a better audience.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, certainly, you know, from my take, the not enough conversations, I mean, that is the crux of it, right? You're not talking to people, you're not closing deals, and I think Brian mentioned that, obviously, along with a couple other problems. I'd love to hear from the audience on the Q&A why you guys feel like these results came out the way it did. I know this is mostly feedback from you, but why? What is it? Not enough conversations with targeted prospects. Is that something that, what's leading to that? If you have thoughts or opinions, please throw it in the Q&A. But let's move to kind of, let's see what Brian and team did in order to overcome this. So Brian mentioned a little bit of a plan based on those areas of opportunity. Brian, maybe you can take us through just at a high level how you started to attack these different areas of opportunity.
Sure. Like any great plan, there's always 3 steps or 3 phases as they highlight, so I think it's a universal theme. We started with a focus on who we're calling and the maintenance of the list of contacts, and then ultimately automation of really the dial and connect and voicemail, email kind of management of the aspect of the process. That's really step 1 in that process. Step 2, when we realize, is that although volume has a quality all its own, that getting better at when you do get maybe partial connections, you get to the right person, you get a referral to the right person, how do you follow up, getting some consistency in messaging, and then even in our particular case, being able to experiment with that messaging and measuring the change in the result that goes with that, and then tying that back into marketing so that if you do get a conversation and they're not ready to purchase, but they might be in the near future, maybe in the next year, that we're properly getting a closed loop process back to marketing, and then ultimately getting sophisticated by truly kind of measuring and weighing the different opportunities and where we should be putting our time and energy. And that really mapped out in this high level view of how we made improvements to what we were doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sounds like a pretty solid plan. I'll be interested to hear how that actually was then kind of tactically put in place. So that was a little bit of the past. Let's now get to the present, where we are now, and how you were then able to overcome and attack some of these. I love this view right here, what the group is now seeing. It's kind of a high-level overview, and I'm a big proponent of this. I'm a process map kind of junkie. I always have, I challenge the audience out there, hey, send me your process map. I probably have now mapped over 250 sales processes in my short tenure in the sales world. But I love how we've kind of broken it out here with, okay, we looked at the sales process and said, you know, we've got lead and list, how we get stuff, and then phase 2 is what do we do with that stuff, and then phase 3 is how do we actually kind of finalize it, we qualify and close it. Just maybe to start out, can you walk us through, this is a high-level version of your process map. Can you just walk us through briefly how you kind of edited or kind of sculpted this to where you wanted it to be?
Yeah, so is it highlighted, you can see it broken up by the phases here of our work activities. First of all, we have to create what is a master list of contacts for us to reach out and call people. So we realized that there were good quality sources. We actually used early on Discover.org and Ranking. We now pull a lot from LinkedIn as well. But we have people that are actually dedicated to the management of that list. And then we use some technology inside sales, which is a seek list, which is an automated way of creating a dial structure where we can pull specific subsets from that for people we actually want to reach out and call. And that really moves us into the phase 2 part about it. And then basically we try to contact them. We had a multi-touch process. We found not only from the reading but our actual experience that 1, 2, 3 attempts to contact people is not nearly enough. And we actually have settled in around a 10-touch process that we try over a 2-week period as we try to reach out and touch people from the standpoint of trying to connect with them. And there are a whole lot of reasons why that kind of repetition, you find even on the 7th, 8th, 9th attempt to contact that it's those contacts you reach them. And so it was a lesson for us that you've got to be a bit persistent in this. And then when we do get somebody on the phone, getting a lot clearer about how we overcome objections and how we get them into a conversation, getting them to talk about their requirements, getting into a lot of the BANT issues. And then we had a fairly steady process where we took them into an introductory meeting, took them to a demo, and then into a proof of concept. So it's really the overview of what we were able to drive there, and ultimately, starting to close customers.
Yeah, perfect. I think that's a great. Yeah, Tibor, go ahead. Jump in.
I was going to say that one of the things that I think Arctic Wolf did exceptionally well is the two areas around the cadence. I think Brian touched on it, that there was a 10-point cadence, but I know that a lot of your stats and a lot of the work that I do with clients are surprised that it takes that many touch points, and some of them are reluctant to do it. And I think that they had a pretty good flow that wasn't just repetitively doing touch points, but there was a cadence, an actual cadence to it. So I think that that was something that was in place and made it easy to do some of the work that came later. And I would argue it also got them to refocus and utilize the band concept a lot more effectively.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I like, Tibor, that you and Brian kind of have been able to do here is very systematically, right, kind of break this up. Let's get step one, how do we get leads better? Let's get a structure around kind of that cadence. Cadence is definitely a buzzword, but I don't think people are finding ways to actually have reps follow it. Sometimes you'll put an SLA in place, but you guys have found a great way to actually ensure that you're following that multi-touch program. And then even at the end of the process, you've got a good structure in the way you demo and take it off. So I love the systematic approach. I think it'd be good to dive into a couple of these key areas and see if we can just do a double click, Brian and Tibor, on a couple of the main areas of opportunity. We won't touch everything, but maybe a couple of these main ones that you had brought up. So maybe let's start with, and you touched on this briefly, but this loss of productivity relating to time finding and researching leads. Now, you had mentioned a little bit about that kind of ranking in LinkedIn and then how you were playing around with that sequence. Can you just double click on that? How's that worked in order to really tighten that part of the process?
Yeah, I think the main idea is we realized the skill set in this area. The people that we're going to be hosting, and driving conversations aren't necessarily, the best at reading through databases, filtering through things, eliminating duplicates, filling out information. We realized there was just a very different role. That was the biggest thing for me. As part of what we did in sales operations, they took responsibility for pulling information from Discover.org, from ranking, from LinkedIn, eliminating duplicates, but also filtering out just based on criteria as we learned over time, what's relevant, what's not. And it allows the people that are doing the dials to not have to worry about the quality of the list coming in. That's the responsibility of a different function.
Yeah, I mean, I've got to admit, I'm glad you highlighted that one. There's some good data out there that says almost 68% of sales reps' time is often spent just hunting and pecking, trying to figure out who to go after. So it sounds like what you've done over at Arctic Wolf, you did actually create a new function, or you pushed that responsibility over to sales operations. They cleaned it. They kind of got the people, they got the list in place so that the sales team or the sales development team was actually just able to do what they do best, which is call, email, qualify, and pass it over. Is that correct?
Yeah, and they're part of a powerful feedback cycle. They're working and looking through the data that comes out of the system. They're talking to the reps about what works, what doesn't, and they're maintaining the quality of that list. That there is a care and feeding of the list. You can't simply just import and then you're done. You've got to constantly be maintaining it, updating it, cleaning it up, realizing that certain efforts for segments or sizes or titles doesn't work, and you want to move those things out so that you're not having your reps wasting time. That you're really institutionalizing your learning, and I think that function does that well.
I mean, I can't disagree. We're seeing this pop up a lot, you guys. This lead researcher, I've heard it's called, or just a sales operations analyst, seeing if you can't specialize that function and really eliminate some of the time waster. Let's move over to the next one. So this is around misdirected effort leading to lesser results. This is such a problem. I kind of hinted at it with a joke, Brian and Tibor, at the beginning. I mean, a lot of sales reps say, hey, I'm trying hard, and they may only be doing, 5 or 10 activities a day. They're just spending time, trying to find stuff. They're on LinkedIn, social selling, but they're not ever getting kind of to the destination. How are you overcome this one and really direct the right effort to the right places?
This is where I think the product solution capabilities became very critical. So by using the seek list, we actually use a mix of the seek list and the domino list, and they're just different uses, but we use both depending on the situation. It's not simply, to me, just a productivity, but it's also a quality of work. Literally dialing 50 phone calls a day. You're looking at your screen, you're looking at the number, you misdial, you're waiting. There's just so much productivity you can gain out of an automated system, not just with the dialing, but it's also quality of work. People can pay attention to the message as opposed to the manual effort of just hunting, pecking, and leaving voicemails and other items. The system really guides them along to the right step there. And we just saw, obviously, a real big improvement in productivity. The volume of what we're able to do was substantive.
So most on the automation. Tibor, what would you add to that?
I think what I would add is an extension of what Brian said, that it's been shown that a lot of times if people are jumping from one activity to the other, the quality of the activity, the lack of continuity just results in poor results. Or even if they're putting their best foot forward, if, as Brian said, they're having to go to hunt, having to dial, to manage objections, whatever the case is. Whereas if you can streamline that and allow them to perform their core activity, and in this case, it was the account development reps reaching out to the prospect, it just flows a lot smoother, and the quality of the conversations changes. That, again, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get instantly better conversations and so on, but as Brian said, you can pay more attention, you can be focused, and really apply your skills to the thing at hand, which is converting a lead to an actual opportunity.
Got it. Well, there's something I got to ask you guys then. I mean, in the audience, we're seeing this in a couple of the Q&A questions. A lot of times people will buy an automation tool, whether it's a dialing tool or a process optimization or an email tool, and they won't see the results, Brian, that you've seen here, which is phenomenal. Did you do any change management around implementing the tool to ensure that people did actually take advantage of some of this automation and see the results that you've basically been able to see?
A couple things. I think obviously you have to align compensation. So we put there's obviously the compensation tied to the benefit we want to get, which is getting meetings with prospects that lead to follow-on activities around opportunity development. But we also did put some specific incentives on dials per day and active conversations, and made it clear that we measured and weighed that. I also think on top of that, you reinforce that by doing it yourself. So this is, for me, learning to live that and see it. And so I actually did use the system for about 6 weeks and understanding it, and it developed an appreciation. Lead by example, I think, is a big aspect here as well.
And what I would
add I can't. Yeah, please, Tibor, go ahead.
I was going to say that the piece that I think a lot of companies should explore that initially they tend to shy away from is actually compensating and recognizing the activities that lead to results. So often the tendency is strictly to reward the resulting appointments or what have you, but those themselves are outcomes of other activities. So if you can put a focus via compensation or other means on the leading activities or the leading indicators that lead to those things, then you get a much greater focus, and it's easier to adjust, make incremental adjustments along the way.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning that, Brian. There's a big push in the market around sales developments, or what you call kind of account development reps, to compensate them mostly or all in on revenue. And, I'm certainly open to debate it, but I think you make a great argument about, hey, you want them to focus on the behaviors that lead to the results you want, and you want them to have psychological ownership of it. And activities isn't bad. It's actually a great place, I think, to be thinking and often playing. Why don't we push kind of something to the group here? I want to just ask for your teams, how many outbound, we're thinking about calls, that's kind of what we talked about with Brian. How many outbound calls are your reps able to make per day? You can fill out kind of the quick question here, less than 30, greater than 150. I dare you to put that one. If there's anybody out there, I'll send you a Snickers bar or something. That'd be really reaming it. Go ahead and put that in, and then in the Q&A box, I'd love to hear any best practices you've used in order to really drive that change, to get you to the numbers where you currently are. And take 30 seconds on that poll question. Okay, looks like we've got, yep, okay. I'm going to go ahead and show the results here. Oops. Hold on one second. A little bit of a technical difficulty. Let me see if I can get it back here. Sorry, I'm going to give you one more chance here on answering that question. I apologize. I accidentally put it to the wrong screen. Go ahead and put it on this one. See if you can answer how many dials you do per person per day, and then I'm going to give you the results here in just a second. Tibor, where do you think we're going to have most of the audience fall?
I think it really depends whether they've embraced automation or not. I think without automation, they're probably going to be in that 50 neighborhood. With that, I could see them exceeding over 100. And I've worked with organizations that have, gone to over 150, but not by much. I think it'll be in and around the median of about 50.
Interesting. All right. Well, let's see. Now that we've given them two chances here to answer the question, let's see where the results come out. It looks like we got about 200 people. We had nobody over the 100 mark. Most people under the 30 mark. I'm not. Well, maybe Brian. I mean, are you surprised about that? It sounds like your team was maybe more in the middle range there. Are you surprised that we've got a large majority right under that 30 mark?
No, I think if you put your mind to it, you can dial 30 to 50 calls a day. It is possible. It's not fun, but it is possible.
Then 50 to 100 isn't fun. Is that what you're implying?
I just think it's amazing how painful it is to look at a number on the screen and then reach over to your phone and dial it and then occasionally misdial it and just everything.
That's right.
It was very frustrating.
Yeah, certainly. And, I think in our world, depends on the model you're running. Sometimes you're a high-velocity model. Sometimes you're an enterprise model. So certainly the number of activities is going to fluctuate depending on what your strategy is. So let's go ahead and continue. We got a couple other points here. Next area of opportunity, unstructured follow-up that missed or unrealized opportunities. You talked a little bit about your multi-touch program. I'd love to hear, maybe you can just double-click on where did you actually end up on your Cadence strategy?
So a big part of this is we mix attempts to directly contact and then leaving emails and voicemails at various points along that process. So in our particular case, we had 10 touches, and we would leave an email voicemail after the first one, after the fourth, and then we'd actually wait to the end and drive that activity. We'd set things up to have the system assist the rep in making sure that they were doing that. So we use the recorded voicemail capabilities so you can move along to the next call and yet leave a voicemail, which gives you a big productivity benefit. But when you did get into conversations with people, you get referrals, you get other items, and you just need a clear process for how you can manage that and make sure that you're really maximizing when you do get to somebody, how you can get to the right kind of conversation.
Yeah. So you ended up with a mix of emails, voicemail, phone calls. It sounded like a 10 touch over 2 weeks. Is that kind of the magic that you found maybe is best practice for article?
Yeah, it was actually 10 touch over 13 business days. So we had a couple of wait days 13. In there just to, so that you had a few days in there where you would, especially the days when we left a voicemail and email, we wanted to give them an opportunity to return the call in that environment. One of the things we did learn actually is we in some cases will start with an email because it also will, we get bounces from emails if there's changed information or they no longer work there. And very often we get a bounced email and it refers us to the right person. So we get a referral without even talking to somebody in some cases. So we've actually started in a few cases now starting with an email just to see if we can get in. And that tends to eliminate a few of the areas where people moved along or there's bad data.
Interesting. So a little bit of a mix and match depending on how you want to start, whether email, phone, but ideally about 13 days, 10 total touches, email, voicemail, and phone. Got it. Okay. And that was significant. It sounds like that was quite a bit different, that structure, than what you had done before. Sounds like before it was a little more of a shooting from the hip. Is that right?
Yeah, I think I would say kind of learning by association. So we'd have somebody who was successful and everybody tended to copy them. We went more to prepared scripts, prepared voicemails, prepared emails, different versions of those things depending on the industry segment, so they could pull those down and automatically send them, automatically leave them. Also prepared scripts, and then we could compare how one script, one email, voicemail combo worked versus another. Is this better? Is it worse? Get an improvement? So it just creates a degree of preciseness that you can then measure and improve on, so you can get a good kind of feedback learning loop going.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. So let's go to this one.
I was just going to add that's part of the cadence that Arctic Wolf had in place is what happens after that 10th attempt. So again, leads are very much recyclable. So I think there was a focus on making sure that there's always fresh opportunities to go after, but that doesn't mean that those won't be revisited, and there was a process for that as well, or there is a process for that as well.
Yeah, a strong recycle program, which I think is always important. So this one, I think the audience has been waiting to hear. This was what they identified to be their biggest area of opportunity, and that was not enough time actually spent talking to prospects. Talk to us a little bit about this. Was there certain things you were able to do or not do in order to kind of move the needle?
A couple things. I think by far I'd say the two largest benefits that we found is, one, having a dialing capability where for the prospect it came up in their area code. And that's a big deal, because if you get a call from an 888 number, an 800 number, or from some random 510 number, and you're not in that area code, you know it's something that you don't want to answer. Where if it comes up local, we just found a much higher connection rate. And also a lot of attention paid to the times of day when people are more likely to answer the calls. It's maybe when a gatekeeper is not there, that maybe they're just starting their day. And both of those things are material. We actually specifically block calendars. We don't schedule company meetings. We don't have other items these times of day, specifically in the local time zone of who you're trying to reach, 8 to 9 and 4 to 5. We actually expanded that a little bit. We would start around 7:45 and go to about 9:15, and the same thing, 3:45 to about 5:15. Were the best time to get connected to people. And that two combinations really, even past just the sheer volume, improved quite dramatically the number of live conversations that we had with people.
Got it. So you were able to mix a little bit of data, a little bit of science, a little bit of technology to really boost a lot around getting those conversations. And that's sometimes the best way to go. I mean, I don't know if there's a lot of tips and tricks. I think Brian's hit on some of the ones that we see most often utilized out in the market. I'm going to go ahead and skip this poll question. I want to make sure we get to some of these other key areas here. We'll hit a couple of these other polls in a minute. Brian, let's just hit these last 2 points. Talking about poor conversations, in my understanding, this is really where you were able to identify Tibor and his company and some of the expertise he was able to bring in. I'd love to hear maybe from both of you. Okay, now you've got leads cleaned, you've got that separated, you've got a structured cadence, you've been able to get more people on the phone, but we got to make sure that the conversations actually move forward as well. How are you able to do this? Maybe we could have Brian first, and then Tibor, you jump in.
Yeah, really quickly. Some things very obvious is obviously trying to speak to the customer's pain points, and rather than talking product, trying to identify needs and focusing on that. It takes a little bit to get past that, getting people engaged. And so one of the things that we found is I'm too busy, send me some data, send me a presentation, call me back. How do you handle those objections in a way? And then how do you get by gatekeepers? And so we found that we didn't have the best mechanisms. Our different account development reps had different ways of dealing with that. And so we put some energy into making sure we worked with that. And then the other part is it's easy for people to fall back into habits, and so you have to have not just the initial training, but repeat and follow up that allows you to make sure that lesson's really going to set home. And then actually listening to taking recordings and listening to the account development reps, how they did it, and pointed feedback that ties them into that. And Tibor was a great assistance in really helping us train and then reinforce what we wanted in that behavior. I'm sorry, Tibor. Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah, Tibor, what would you add to that?
I mean, I would say that everything you've discussed up to this point that we looked at, that Brian and the team had put into effect, if you allow the analogy, is really they made sure that their guys had as many opportunities at bat as possible. So all the things in terms of the local presence, the time zones, the processing of the leads and so on, just ensured, to the poll earlier in terms of enough conversations, they made sure that their guys got more at-bats. So my role was really to come in and say, okay, so you've got this increase of at-bats. What can we do to increase your batting average and really compound the effect of both? So, if we look at some of the things that were brought into practice, again, we took a structured approach. So to step back, I think one of the things that we always do is spend some time talking to Brian and the head of sales at the time to really make sure that I understood where they were trying to go, and so on. As Brian said, we wanted to get people talking about something other than the product, and really what we wanted to do is focus on what the buyers are struggling with and what their objectives are. So if we can eliminate a hurdle or a barrier between where they are and where they want to be, they're going to be more likely open to listening. Again, no guarantee that they'll buy or do anything, but they're going to identify more with what we're saying on the phone. The other that I think we do differently and make sure that our clients follow through on is there's a whole bunch of different dynamics that are going on. As been alluded to in the call several times, these people are getting calls all over the place. So if an average person gets 5 calls a day, that's 1,200 calls over the course of the year. And if they've been in the job for the last 5 years, that's 6,000 calls. So how are you going to sound different? How are you going to manage that dynamic? So a lot of people do a great job on working on their messaging and the content, but they don't pay much attention to how does that message land. And if the message doesn't get through, it really doesn't matter how good it is. And then if we can get them to engage, then it's a question of how do you handle the most common objections. So the reality is most people are trying to avoid objections. In the nature of the role, they're part and parcel of the game. And you know that you're going to get the 5 most common ones, which is we're all set, not interested, busy, send me some stuff where they've had a bad experience. And we made sure that the ADRs were ready for each of those 5 as they came up. So if we can address those and take those objections away, then we move more towards a real conversation. And as a result of having a conversation, you can really deliver your message. So a lot of the emphasis was on how do we change our habits to deal with the dynamics and then let the content flow through that. And as Brian mentioned, we looked at voicemail, email. I really don't like the term gatekeepers because right away it puts us in sort of an adversarial position, but the role of the person that's between you and the individual or individuals that you need to talk to. And I think the other is the follow-through. We had planned out before we even rolled out the program, we rolled out a year's worth of reinforcement on a regular schedule. And as Brian mentioned, prior to these follow-through sessions, and early over the first 3 months, it was fairly frequent because we wanted to make sure that they're developing the right habits and they have somebody that they can come back to and work things through what's working, what's not. But, prior to each of those sessions, and as I say, in the first 12 weeks, I think we had about 8 of those, we had, Brian's team had sent forward some MP3s of the various calls. So we were actually able to get in and speak to specifics and talk about what they're doing right, because there was a lot of things being done right, and then point out to them maybe when they were sort of slipping back into previous habits. And as I say, the first 3 months were quite intense, and then monthly we had follow-throughs, plus the team had constant communication with me. So if they ran into a challenge or they ran into a particular thing that we hadn't discussed, there was a resource for them to go to and figure things out as opposed to being left on their own. So I would say it's a combination of those things that allowed them to improve their batting average, which, again, was a bonus on top of the additional at-bats that the things Brian spoke to prior resulted in.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot. That's a lot of information, Tibor, but I like some of the content, especially around overcoming objections. I just think we allow reps to kind of go free willy, and it turns into sometimes a little bit of a mess. You know what the typical objections are going to be. If you can run, I mean, think of the sports analogy. You've used a few of those. If they're going to rush forward, then you probably need to run a different type of offense. If they're going to run this, then you've got to run that. And I think companies who organize and structure some of these types of qualification activities, they're just going to see better results. Anything else you want to add to that, Tibor? I think that's a pretty powerful statement.
I would say the one thing that I would add that I think, again, pointed to the collective approach here is that we made sure that all the messaging aligned. So whatever the 10 touch points were during the 10 business days, whatever was in the voicemail, and I think most importantly, to wrap it up, we relied on taking away the objections using the same content and same messaging as we did in the introduction and the touch points. So there was a consistency that I think drew people into the conversation as opposed to the inconsistency, which generally gets people to wonder and then look for the exits.
Yeah, that holistic and kind of strategy that combines it all is, I think, something that organizations have to work towards. Consistent messaging throughout the entire process. All right, let's continue up here. We're getting towards the end. I'm going to skip this poll question. I want to hear, we've heard kind of where you are, Brian, Tibor. We've heard about some of the things the levers you were able to pull, the checks you were able to check. These results. Can you walk us through where you are now as far as seeing some of these amazing numbers come through?
Yeah, I mean, the chart pretty much speaks for itself. So just on a activity basis, we saw a tripling. I actually have a few of my ADRs that are averaging between 180 and 190 calls a day. They tend to be a bit harder worker, and they get more conversations as a result. But I think not just simply the volume, but when we do get somebody on the phone, dealing with those objections and getting them engaged and into the process where we can show them value, and we saw that result. We're actually, I think, trending even slightly better than what's shown in the slides here. This data is a little bit older, but we're getting closer to 30 to 33, so the percentage improvement between both the tool and the method and the process and the training that we took people through, we saw a market improvement. I think it's not just for us, but I also think that just quality of life, doing all that dialing and being uncertain about things, you just get a better environment for people to work as well. So I think both of those things were big improvements.
Yeah, I mean, those numbers are fantastic, but I love that last point. I mean, when you build an environment where people can be successful, guess what? They're more happy. I mean, I don't know if people hit on that much. You enable them, and it enables their family, and everyone becomes a little bit more benefited. I think that's a real valuable point there. Tibor, anything you'd add on these numbers? Again, the results kind of speak for themselves, but anything you'd want to touch on?
I would just build out on the last point that Brian made. I work with a lot of teams, and I think that you get a sense for the level of commitment that the individual members have to their role in the company's success and so on. And I think that as things built and they saw what they were getting to, the team was a lot more committed. So even if you look at a simple thing, I think in the 18 or so follow-through sessions that I had with the team, nobody has ever missed one, which is probably unique among the hundreds of companies that I've trained, where people will always find something, I had an important appointment and so on. But I think the discipline driven by the process, or maybe the process that drove the discipline, it showed through every aspect, including, for me, a unique measure is, how many follow-throughs do they miss? And not to miss any out of 18, I think speaks highly for the team and their commitment to the company.
Yeah, I mean, they certainly are phenomenal results. So let's see if we can move to kind of the summary here. Brian, you've obviously, this is not your first rodeo. You've done multiple businesses that have been successful. Tibor, you've been out on the road as a road warrior, helped many clients kind of achieve transformation. You put down a couple ideas here. How would you coach or recommend companies? I'd love to hear from both of you. Maybe we start with Brian again first, but walk us through kind of keys to really getting to that optimized or transformed state.
Yeah, I think in a broad function, first you've got to recognize a difference between account execs or account managers and people that are doing appointment setting. So it's not that people that are account execs can't do that appointment setting, but I think having specialized role there has a lot of power. You really gain some benefit out of that. But then breaking down, being clear about your value propositions and issues, that's very critical. And then starting to look through, okay, what's the right kind of target account? How can I build a list and maintain a list for me to contact people? And then creating measurement mechanisms so that not everything's going to work exactly the same for every organization. You got to have a good feedback loop. And even something that works now evolves in 6 months from now. Maybe your product changes, maybe the market changes, and recognizing that shift and moving with it, I think, is critical. And obviously try to, I think you can solve this problem in layers, and so you can use some tools, you can do some training, you can then focus on good feedback and the right kind of sales methodology. So I mean, it's all outlined in the slide here.
Yeah, no, I think those are some pretty solid points. Tibor, anything you'd add to this or any commentary you'd want to put up?
I think it's the willingness to evolve. I think if you look at the 3 points and the sub-bullet points, you need to have a clear understanding of where you are and where you want to be, but you also have to be willing to respond and evolve with the marketplace. And the key to that, which I think has been, again, a subtext throughout today's presentation, is what's the data telling you? There's a lot of emotion in sales and there's a lot of different things, but if you can continue to evolve your process based on the data, be willing to let go of certain things that were perhaps sacred a year ago, willing to experiment with different things, but let the data and the process work together, and then put it into practice, look at the results, refine, and then start that cycle again. And I think sometimes people get on a path and they're reluctant to make changes as they go along. But clearly, if you look at this slide, it keeps talking to plan, evolve, and then move forward.
I think that's some real solid advice from people who've done it. We want to close it out here, everybody, and open it up into a quick Q&A. We had a handful of questions we'll try to get to real quick. But just so everyone knows, this webinar is recorded. We'll make sure you get an email link probably tomorrow. Feel free to share it with your friends. There's also some resources available in the screen here if you want to try to download some of those to make sure that you get and practice some of these best practice topics that have been discussed today. So just before we jump off, let's try to jump into a couple of these Q&As. I'm going to try to hit Francis Richards first from Starship Logics. Potentially for Brian here, very beginning of the process, what tools are you using to clean the data with that sales ops team so that you can get to a more targeted and focused list? Any tools that you found to be really helpful there?
I think I put them in a couple different categories. The first is just data sources, so DiscoverOrg, RainKing. We actually use Leadlander and LinkedIn, all 3 of those, and people spend a lot of energy cross-referencing these 2. We do a lot of deduplication, so we want to make sure that we're not, loading up leads and getting duplicated information in there. So we do use some Salesforce dedupe tools to make sure we merge things up appropriately. We also put a big emphasis with our account development reps when they learn things to make sure they're updating data and the information. There's a wealth of what we've learned where customers will tell you, I'm not doing something now, but I'm going to be doing something next March. And so we're really thorough about making sure we document that, and we're reaching back out to them a month or 2 before that as part of our re-engaging them in this process. And so a lot of emphasis with the ADRs on that record keeping, realizing their long-term benefits that come from that.
Got it. Perfect. Are you using just Salesforce inherently for the dedupe tool? Are you doing that more manually, or what's kind of that dedupe process? Do you know how that's functioning?
We've used a couple different tools. There's some group bulk tools and some individual tools. We actually use both. I haven't found one I would particularly recommend, so I think they have all, for me, generally been fairly decent. But you do need a tool for the people doing the list management, doing bulk deduplication, but also for the ADRs, the account managers, doing kind of looking at individual contacts and making sure there's not duplicates in that case.
Got it. Perfect. Next question. This one comes from George. He talked a little bit about targeting decision makers. is your process. How did you target decision makers? Was there a certain key you were able to do to get to more decision makers? It sounded like we were trying to figure out the best way to do that.
So we had a hypothesis. So we had an industry segment, size, and title combination, and we basically experimented around that. So we would play with the size, we'd play with the title, play with the industry segment, and just keep iterating and measuring and iterating and measuring. And every once in a while you'd find a vein of, oh, this is a much more productive than normal, till you pretty much worked your way through that. And that's just a continuous process. That's where the measurement and feedback activity is critical, I think.
Perfect. I mean, sometimes I feel like the science of selling is actually testing. You take a hypothesis, segment, title, you test it. If it works, great. If not, you need to iterate. That sounds like you guys kind of took that approach. Let's see if we can just hit these two more. Tibor, this one's a little bit more for you. We did get a question around that overcoming objections. You listed kind of your top 5 overcoming objections. I think it was top 5. I didn't necessarily write those down. Sounds like we needed to hear those one more time. Any quick thoughts about the top objections you hear and overcoming those for people to take away from today's webinar?
I think the top one that most of us will hear, and I think certainly was the case with the team that I worked with, is that we're all set, we're good, or some iteration of that. The other 4 are we're not interested, they don't have time now, they don't have time 6 months from now, they don't have time till the second coming. They've had a bad experience with something that they figure you are, so that often they just, have that response of, oh, we tried that and we had a bad experience, even though they tried it when everything was still DOS. And then lastly, they want you to send some information. So our goal was to take away those objections because, again, after about 6,000 calls, as I mentioned earlier, people really, it's more a conditioned response. So here's another call from another, IT vendor. I'm going to say I'm all set, and, the guy's going to get tongue-tied and I can go back to work. So our goal was to take away the first objection so we can actually deal with a genuine answer. And if you listen to the calls, that was the flow where their initial response was the same that they gave the last 5,000 times. The ADRs at Arctic Wolf dealt with it, and we have a specific way that we talk to them about dealing with it. That first objection was taken away, and that's when things began to bubble up that the ADRs were able to seize on and turn into a conversation and then ultimately turn into an introductory meeting. I think it's tied back to what we talked about earlier, and that is how can we continue to show them that what we're talking about, A, demonstrates that we understand what their objectives are and perhaps what's in the way of achieving those objectives, and then hand in hand with that, here is how we have been able to solve that for other customers in similar scenarios, which then leads to the engagement, which leads to the conversation, and then ultimately the conversion to the introductory call or the appointment.
Yeah, I love it. I think that's a great framework to start thinking about overcoming objections. So we're getting to the top of the hour. Everybody, really appreciate your interaction. A couple more Q&As. We'll try to answer those individually. Really appreciate you taking the time again. Please do connect with Brian, Tibor, myself. We're always happy to continue the dialogue and talk about how you can transform your sales through people, systems, and processes. Brian and Tibor, thanks so much for joining. I think there's some great information today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody, and have a great day. Bye-bye.